Okay, I think we're good to go. So we are live. This is an episode of Nonfiction Narrative Discourses, aka Beyond the Bio. And we are welcoming Associate Professor Amos, who has graciously agreed to be with us and talk about the main things that I'm trying to ask with this project are: where are you from? Why are you here? And why do you teach what you teach? But that we can go into as specific details as you want, or not. Either way, we're just trying to go beyond the bio that's on the webpage, because sometimes those bios, either they're not up to date or there's just not a whole lot of information that would help someone understand what type of classes you teach and what you're concerned about as far as English and literature goes.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, where are you from?
I was born actually outside Chicago, and then we moved outside New York, and then we moved outside Miami, and that's where I grew up, is Miami, Florida.
Okay. So what was your college career like?
I went to Cornell, uh, in part because it's Cornell, and in part because it was about as far away as I could get from my folks, who are wonderful people, in the continental United States. So I went north instead of diagonally, and I did 4 years, graduated there, and then came back to Miami, and fell into high school teaching, substitute teaching, and then permanent sub teaching, mainly actually in the sciences and math, and then got a permanent job teaching English, which is what I was after, and did that for a number of years, and then decided that that was not really where I wanted to spend the rest of my career. And so I went to the University of Miami for a master's degree, and then once I had that, then I went to Duke for a PhD.
Okay. So Middle English literature, is that what you studied at Duke?
That's what I studied at Duke. At undergraduate, I took the general BA, reading and tons and tons and tons of courses. And then at University of Miami, I studied Renaissance, and that was good. And I moved toward medieval then, and I found that really interesting. And then decided that in the next program, I really needed to focus on medieval. And the medievalist there, who assures me that it wasn't personal, was encouraging of me to go elsewhere, because at that point and at most points, the job market is very tight. And so he wasn't sure that a degree from him and University of Miami was going to stand me in very good stead for the profession. So then I went to Duke, which was absolutely going to stand me in good stead. They had just invested in a large number of very big names in English and really revamped a pretty standard department into quite a stellar program. And I was lucky enough to get in there right at the cusp of that. So
Nice.
it was quite a wonderful experience. It really was.
So then
And
how
that's
did
where I cemented the medieval there. I had been interested in it as an undergraduate, and the Cornell had some pretty fine people and very interesting, and they made it quite intriguing and were very self-disclosing as to what they found interesting about it. And part of it was that it's a puzzle, and the language is a puzzle. And if you go to Old English instead of Middle English, then there are words that only exist once in literature, and that's, I thought, was a pretty interesting puzzle to figure out what one word means if it doesn't. If you have one context for one word, and there's no roots, and there's no stemma, and you can't figure out necessarily what it must mean, then what must it mean? And I thought that was a pretty interesting puzzle to get into. And I was told accurately that you can get to the edges pretty quickly, and then you're in uncharted territory where, of course, on the maps there be dragons. And so it was interesting things at the edges, and that started to intrigue me. I also found it interesting that it was so different. I had taken a lot of anthropology courses as an undergraduate, and the pretty much the standard ones. So we read about the Yanomamo tribes and Nanook of the North and others, with a thick description, ethnographies, the Clifford Geertz, and other anthropologists of the time. And I thought that was really interesting. And then but I really liked literature, and I thought, well, if I go to medieval, I can really get the best of both of those worlds, because it is a different, as the famous quote is, the past is a foreign land. They do things differently there. And so I could study different foreign lands that aren't current, and through the literature, rather than the kind of more empirical based studies I would need to be doing if I were an ethnographer.
That kind of goes to one of my questions was, I guess I wanted to know, as far as when you started studying literature or studying Middle English literature, was it the language that brought you to it, or was it the stories that brought you to it?
It was really the combination. When I took one of my early medieval classes at Cornell as an undergraduate, we all had to do an independent, well, not an independent, but an out of class project. And there were a number of different choices, one of which was to meet with the professor and whatever other students had selected that option every, we'll say, Wednesday night, and read and learn to pronounce and learn to really do the Middle English, because the course itself was in modern English, but this was the add-on project was to learn the Middle English. And that was really exciting and very interesting, and a really nice introduction to small group learning and advancing in groups and pronunciation and all kinds of really terrific. And I thought, this is really, and we get to read really cool stuff. I mean, I had done some Latin, and I have, as a medievalist, have done quite a bit of Latin, but the stories in Latin weren't quite as interesting as the ones I was reading in Middle English, and then also Old English.
Huh. So if someone were to hand you a text that you weren't familiar with, do you feel like you could parse out what it's saying? You feel like you're fairly fluent?
Middle English?
Yeah.
I got it.
Nice.
I got it. Old English, not so much anymore. I taught at Bates College for that. I had a 1-year replacement job there. That was my first position out of graduate school. So the medievalist was on sabbatical, and they needed someone to do that. And I was there, and there was a student there who wanted to do an independent study. He wanted to do a whole class in Anglo-Saxon, or what we used to call Anglo-Saxon, Old English. And he was, of course, the sole person there who had any interest in it whatsoever. So I did an independent study with him. But that's really the last time that I have taught a whole course in Old English. When I teach Beowulf, I teach parts of it in Old English, but most of it in Middle English. In modern English, or what we call present day English, because you just can't pick it up and put it down. I think that's also true to a greater extent with Middle English than we admit. So we teach the survey class, and suddenly we teach one work, generally A Canterbury Tale or the general prologue, in Middle English, and then everything's back to modern English or early modern English if you're going chronologically. And it's really unreasonable to expect students to suddenly be able to read Middle English. And it's not quite like a faucet. It's very much like English, but it's also much less like present day English than Elizabethan English, and think how much trouble folks have with Shakespeare.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So I'm currently teaching a course in Chaucer that is wholly in Middle English, because that's the whole course. So we get to work on pronunciation, and we get to work on spelling. And I used to spend far more time on that than on the narratives, but the student interest is more in the narratives, and we need to know enough to go along. And you don't need to understand every word in a poem that's going to last 20 pages, right? If you're reading a poem that lasts a page, you should probably understand every single word and how they fit together and whatnot. So that's how I justify really just introducing students to Middle English. And then we do many passages in Middle English. Students memorize 18 lines, often the first 18 lines of the general prologue, but it's up to them. And then they need to recite that from memory in class. And then we also do recorded readings where they can have the text in front of them, but we're working on the presentation. So I'm really trying to get the look and the feel of Middle English without slogging through all the grammar and all the cases. And it's not, the payoff there is pretty slim for all the work you'd have to put into it.
Sure. So what was your path eventually to SIU?
I got the first job was at, as I mentioned, Bates College up in Maine, and it was a 1 year job, and there was no chance of renewal because the person who was on sabbatical was absolutely coming back from sabbatical to take her position back. And so after that, I got a job, a tenure track job at Wilkes University, which is a very small university in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is near Scranton.
Okay.
So northeastern Pennsylvania, and it was a great place to be. It was a 4-4 teaching load, so it's the heaviest teaching load really that is standard, except for community colleges, which can be 5-5. In general, I mean, you may know all this, but so it was a very heavy teaching load, and there was no time to do research, and the school wasn't very encouraging of research. And I had been trained up pretty good in research and thought that was quite an important thing to do. As an undergraduate. As a graduate student, I was part of a pilot program, which has since become a national program, called Preparing Future Faculty. And what it does is it concentrates on the teaching aspect of being faculty members, because the structure of it was that they would take graduate students at large research institutions such as Duke, and they would marry them to local liberal arts schools so that we could go. Mine was Guilford College, also in North Carolina, not very far away. And so I would get to go over there and talk to their faculty and have lunch with their faculty and sit in on their classes and give lectures and teach and really see how that aspect of the academy works, because most institutions reproduce themselves.
Sure.
So if you go to a giant research institution, you come out as a giant researcher, or at least that's what the career path seems to be. And if you go to a liberal arts college, then or a smaller teaching university for your graduate, then that tends to be what you wanted to do. And what they were trying to do is cross-pollinate that, which is evidently caught on. Well, not evidently, it's absolutely caught on. And there are pairing programs all over the place, and it's a really good way to see other aspects of teaching, because other aspects of the profession. If you're at a research institution, all the pressure is on what you're going to publish and what your research is, you sort of lose sight of why, the other half of why you're there, or maybe the vast majority of why you're there, which are the students. And yet you go to a liberal arts place and their library doesn't have all those books, and they don't have all the resources, and their students are far more important to them. When I taught at Bates, which is a small liberal arts college, in the Golden Triangle up in Maine, my fall there, students kept coming to my office hours.
Wow.
And which was great.
Yeah.
And we would have nice conversations, and they would leave. And then my next office hours, a student would show up and we'd have nice conversations, which I would love for students to do at SIU. It's quite a different situation.
Sure.
Students would show up, and I finally asked one of my colleagues, I said, I love the fact that these students are coming to my office hours, but why are they coming to my office hours?
Right.
They're not asking any questions, of what's the test on? I don't understand material. There wasn't anything specific. And they said, oh no, we tell them that from orientation on. They're supposed to go to each of their professors' office hours at least once a semester and just meet them. And just get to know them as people. And that is such a tremendous boon to the student-teacher relationship that it's really surprised that more institutions don't go that way.
Right.
In fact, that's part of that sentiment is part of the reason that we'll get back to how I got to SIU, but at SIU for a number of years, I was running the student success program. I was the dean of the University College, which was put together to support students because the attrition rate is too high. And a lot of our students who come in weren't getting the kind of support that they needed in order to succeed. And that's not reasonable, and certainly not sustainable. And you could even say it's unkind. And so we built in these structures for them. And part of it is to realize that your instructors are people, because it's surprising to those of us who are behind the big desk how evidently terrifying we are. Right? We know ourselves as nice people and reasonable people and willing to help our students, but evidently once we walk into that classroom, we've got fangs and horns and red eyes and all kinds of terror. And I get it. It's the power position. It's not unreasonable response. It's just one that we have to take apart.
Sure.
Because it's not very helpful and it doesn't encourage students, and it seems to suggest that there's only a type of student that succeeds in the academy and a type of student that belongs. And we want everybody here. We want to figure out how to make this work for a variety of students who started, both the students who have been successful and been well resourced, and the students who have not been particularly successful and been under resourced for their whole academic careers, right, their whole lives, basically up until this point. So it was that was part, I think, of what preparing future faculty encourages, is not only trying to get the students to see the professors as real people, but more importantly, to see our students as more than just there to learn our subject matter. Right? It turns out some of them are actually whole people.
Imagine it.
It's frightening, but it's very interesting. And for me, that kind of how do we build a student identity is part of what we were trying to do, because our students, many of our students, and I don't want to paint with as big a brush as I'm going to paint with, many of our students, all of our students know that they are going to college. Mm-hmm. But many of our students do not think of themselves as college students. And that's a shift that they really need to make in order to be able to embrace what we're doing here, and in order to be able to throw themselves into it with all that they need to be able to succeed. And for me, that's what I work on in my medieval research, is how do these folks construct their identities? Out of what materials do they construct their identities? And how then do they validate those identities, and how do they inhabit those identities? So that's part of what I do in my research, is look at different groups or individuals and figure out from the texts and obviously the surrounding world, as much as I can get into it, of the time, how they become who they are.
That's kind of what this whole project was about, is kind of bridging some gaps. It's nice. Whenever I've looked into taking certain classes, I try to see who the professor is and what are they all about, where are they from, and what are their research interests. I think that's helpful to know, just because it says a little bit about who this person is and possibly how they will teach. So, sometimes this type of kind of getting to know you thing is just helpful. So,
right. Oh, absolutely. And part of the literature we teach, part of the reason people write literature is to help other people figure out identities and aspects of themselves. That's why the coming of age novel is so important, because we're all hopefully come of age. And so it's a stage we're all going to go through, and we can watch someone else from an environment very similar to ours, or in an environment completely different from ours, go through the same kinds of processes. So part of what I work with is how they use texts to define themselves. So I'm just going to give you one example of a piece I did on the Carpenters Union, or Carpenters Guild in the Middle Ages. And a guild is like a union, except it's also vertical. So it's not just a union can only be workers, right? Management can't be in unions. But in the guilds in the Middle Ages, it's everybody who's associated with the carpenters. So it's the gigantic multinational carpenters, and it's the people with hammers in your hovel helping you keep things, putting it together, or building furniture for you or whatnot. So I went through the documents as to how they envisioned themselves in the guild documents, as an entity, as a collective, as a workforce, as an economic force, and guilds had social responsibilities in the Middle Ages too, right? If a royal or somebody, a nobleman comes to town and there's a parade, your guild has to put on its guild uniform and show up, right? Because you have a civic responsibility to do that, because it's the city that gives you your charter. to be
Okay.
that. So you have to pay them back. You have to be responsible for that. So it's not just what do we do as carpenters, it's they socialize together and they have to go to these responsibilities. They have funerals and you have to go to all the other carpenters' funerals and all kinds of interdependent relationships. And so what does that mean for you as you? And so that was part of what I was looking at with that. And then I've tried to do that with other groups and to see how that works. My dissertation project, which I haven't converted to a book, it's not sure it'll ever be a book. Pieces of it I've gotten out, but it talks about William Caxton, who is the man who brought the printing press to England. So he's the guy who introduced printing to England 20 some odd years after printing was introduced to Europe, right, by Gutenberg and his mechanically reproduced Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so the trick with Caxton, and he published 106 different titles in his lifetime, as far as we know. And they shifted from gigantic tomes of King Arthur stories down to little flyers and this and that. And so it was really interesting because part of his issue was there is no readership, right? Up until him, all the texts are reproduced by hand, generally by monks or by scribes. So you need a book, you go in and say, I'd like this book, and somebody copies it for you.
Right.
Well, now suddenly he's producing between 500 and 1,000 books. Well, who's he going to sell them to? And so what he needed to inscribe, my argument is what he needed to do is inscribe into his books this new reading audience, because he had to make it seem as if it already existed. And so he melded two classes in medieval society, or two estates, to create this unified group that didn't actually exist as a unified group at all, except that they were the ones who could read. They were the ones who had been trained. They were the ones who were rewarded for being able to read. They were the ones who were credentialed and whatnot. And so he invented this group and then marketed to them. So it's a really interesting project. But again, it's how do people define themselves? And he's trying to get them to define themselves in a particular way. The carpenters are probably not trying to define themselves in a particular way, but they are.
Right.
Through their texts. And then there's behavioral manuals as to how my first piece was I think it's the first published, was on courtesy literature. How are you supposed to behave? And so the first question is, who's reading this? Because the people who are raised in royal houses and in noble houses, they know how to behave because everybody around them is behaving that way.
Sure.
So it's the people who aren't. So it's the other people who are on the edge of that group who are trying to figure out how to behave properly. Right? Does the pinky go up when you sip? Do you get to reach across the table? What do you say when you meet somebody? All those kinds of things. And so that's a conscious effort to reconstruct yourself so you can pass as this is. So if you can make the jump, then you're in.
Right.
And so it's a really interesting time because there's a lot of socioeconomic shifts. The plague wiped out between 25 and 30%, maybe higher, of the population. So suddenly labor has value that it didn't have before. Before you could just fire anybody you wanted to, it didn't matter, right? There's plenty of workers down the road.
Right.
Apropos of our current situation, you used to be able to pay wait staff anything you wanted to.
Right.
Now you can't because the labor shortage has increased the value. So that means there's more disposable income. That means more people can have objects and interests that are more moneyed, which means they're now associating with a slightly different group of people, or at least imitating that group of people, which of course was resisted. Like crazy. They passed law after law after law saying people who aren't of this rank can't wear this color. People who aren't of this rank can't wear this fur. People who aren't of this rank can't do. And the fact that they passed so many of these laws tells you they didn't work at all. Right? If the first law had worked, they'd have been done.
Right.
So clearly the social boundaries are shifting and changing. So that's in the Middle English period, the later Middle English. And so that's a really exciting period to study because it's very dynamic.
So how are those new publications being marketed, for lack of a better word? How does anyone know that these publications are happening and available?
For Caxton?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting. When he first starts, he goes by the patronage presentation model. And so he publishes a giant book of Arthur stories translated into English for the king. And he says, now I know the king speaks French because the Arthur stories were in French. But I've translated this so that other people around the king can read it. But the king, there is a question as to whether or not the king was still speaking French at that point in time. But throughout the Middle Ages, the English aristocrats were much closer to the French aristocrats than the English aristocrats were to the English people. Right? The aristocrats all came from the same families and intermarried and made treaties and all kinds of things. So they were together. So he presents it to the king, and he inscribes it, he prints it in there that he's going to present it to the king. So it's this giant, heavy, important book that the word would have spread. Oh, somebody just gave this Caxton guy, he's got this new machine. You wouldn't believe it, right? It's like 100 monks at once, printing all of these copies, and it's really interesting. And physically, because I'm interested in the materiality of identity too, physically, if you look at the book, you would think it was a manuscript because it looks handwritten, because that's what early type looked like, because that's what it was supposed to look like. The books were handwritten. So if you're going to print a book, you're going to print a book that looks handwritten.
So this is like pre-fonts.
Yes.
Right.
Well, or we now have fonts that imitate that.
Right.
Right. So it's a standard scribal hand that he's reproducing with his movable type, which is pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's how the word gets out. And then he's also publishing broadsheets, which is how a lot of folks got their news anyway.
Okay.
So now suddenly these broadsheets are printed, and so they're different. And so you can look at them differently. And then paper becomes more available because the manuscripts are written on vellum, right? They're written on sheep. And so then the paper gets in, and then as Caxton progresses, the books that he publishes get shorter. No, that's wrong. He publishes shorter books and shorter works in cheaper and cheaper bindings, because what he's realized is that he's invented mass production, or he hasn't invented it, but he certainly brought it to England.
Right.
And so he doesn't need a giant presentation copy for the king anymore. He's got 500 copies to move. So he needs, so many of the books that he printed, they called it sold white, which means no binding. You just go get a bunch of papers tied together with string, and that's your book, because the binding is incredibly expensive.
Right.
Right. So suddenly the paper is now the cheaper part, and the binding has become the more expensive part, whereas the vellum was as expensive as the bindings it was in.
So was there an industry unto itself that was just binding books if someone had the money to do it?
There was, you would take it to, I'm not sure I'd call it an industry, but there was a cottage industry doing that. Yes. So you could take it to somebody to bind your book.
Okay. And the broadsheets you were talking about earlier, is the broadsheets the way someone, like, say how you said, we're saying that a certain guild, if you could or couldn't wear a certain color, that sort of thing, is those rules that were being implemented, how would people know about those rules? Is that the broadsheets?
I think it would be, I haven't actually looked into that. When the sovereign made proclamations, they would be taken into towns and read out loud.
Okay.
And I don't know if they were leaving behind copies, because that's it, right? It had to get through the countryside.
Sure. So this is like the hear ye.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody's riding a horse. Exactly.
Okay. Okay. Got it. That makes sense.
I don't know what I can't. News of the World, is that the Tom Hanks movie where he goes in? It's frontier America. But that's what he does, is he goes into towns and he reads from newspapers to the people who aren't getting newspapers.
Okay.
And so then he reads. So that's alive and well hundreds of years later in frontier America.
Sure. Well, I did want to, I think we've kind of touched on it, but I wanted to bring it up and say thank you, because I did take your language analysis course a few years ago. And I reread through some of the syllabus that you had given us, because you added like an addendum called the Professor Soapbox. And and in
That's my broadsheet.
yes, and I have to say, I think you're one of the only professors that I've had who has done this, but I think it was very smart, and I hope everyone read it. And it basically it basically was encouraging everyone to use the library for what it is, not towards any class or anything. To actually go to the library, enjoy the library, get a book that you would enjoy reading, because if we are educating ourselves for the liberal arts, that's kind of one of the principles, is just using that for your own purposes to become a better person.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. I'm glad you enjoy. I still do that
good.
on the end of my syllabi, because I do think it's a privilege to be able to study at the level that we are able to study at in this country. It's amazing.
Absolutely.
And it's absolutely rare. And the fact that we have this storehouse that we have, right, Alexander's library, we have this storehouse of knowledge going as far back as we can go, right there, is absolutely staggering. It's really amazing. I was in England. I was lucky enough to be in England at a conference giving a paper, and I went to the British Museum and was looking around because they have lots and lots and lots of early texts of all kinds, and they have the copy of Beowulf because there's only one. Right? There aren't multiple manuscripts. That's how, in the Middle English period, that's how we try and ascertain the popularity of a text, is how many manuscripts were reproduced, right, by hand and circulated, and how different are they, because they change every time, because it's a human writing it down, right? So everything changes. But I was leaving the museum and I hadn't found the Beowulf, and I asked someone just on my way out, and they said, "Oh, it's over there." And I ran down and looked, and I'd seen an early King Arthur, I'd seen a Caxton printed text and whatnot, but the Beowulf's the only one, right? And it's damaged. It was almost lost in a fire. So it's got burns on the side, and it's got wormholes, bookworm through it, and all kinds of, and it's really just staggering to look at something that was so old and so important. And without that, we would have a very different idea of the Anglo-Saxon folks, right? We would really, that changed our perspective of what they were interested in. It's the only epic we have from them, so clearly they were interested in epic. It tells us a lot of things, and it's so even if, and we have rare books also in Morris Library, but it's, even if they're not rare, it's still pretty amazing. It's as I say in my syllabus, it's the summoning of ghosts of people long dead to talk to them.
Yes.
And that's pretty close to magic.
Oh, I agree. That was something else I wanted to mention. So you've got a portion on reading, and you say, though it is sometimes work, reading is not a chore. It is a magical process whereby you summon the voices of long dead, thoughtful and talented people who had something interesting to say, and who can be your teachers. And I think that's the magic of literature, is it connects us here now to people who are long gone. And that's amazing. We get to know their thoughts and their ideas, and that's an amazing process. And then my husband's a painter, and he writes words on his paintings a lot, and he says something very similar, where writing is just squiggles on a page, and through the magic of being able to read, we can interpret what someone is thinking, and that's amazing. That's amazing and magical. So I appreciate you sharing that.
It absolutely, and it moves from the whatever it is we perceive, and then we put it into oral words, and then we have to translate that into this code,
right,
that we have, right? That it's just squiggles, as you say, and a similar process goes with your husband's medium, right? Which paint is, you can look at a painting and you can appreciate a painting and understand nothing about it, or you can look at a painting and have some art, because the paintings I look at are generally pretty old, and have some art historian say, well, you can see why the background here, because it's this way, that tells us this. And so they've got the key, right, to unlock this, and you can perceive it and enjoy it and appreciate it and enter into a conversation with the original painter without all of that. But sometimes that's really neat to know. I was in a museum, the Chicago Art Institute, and wandering around with my, little headphone. Everybody's got their headphones for the tour, and except this person next to me, this small child with I'm assuming her mother, and and they're looking at a painting, and the kid says, "What's happening? There are soldiers with those babies." And I look over, and it's the slaughter of the innocents. It's the killing of all the under 2-year-old Jews, because Christ is supposed to be born, and Herod is trying to trying to prevent that. And so I said, I don't mean to, I don't mean to overhear, but here's what this is about. So this is actually, well, it's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing, and this and that. It points toward this larger, greater good. And then the person said, "Oh yeah, well, we like Jesus in our family. That's great. This was paving the way for this, and this is whatnot." And would they have gotten it without that? Well, no, it would have been soldiers killing little babies. Did they get anything out of me telling them that? Probably not. But I just couldn't resist.
Oh, of course.
I thought it would be helpful if they could contextualize it, so it's not a random slaughter. It's a slaughter ordered by Yahweh.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Which I'm not sure makes it better, but it does culturally.
Well, and that's part of the transcendence of art, is being able to share things with other human beings. Even emotions. I was saying with the reading, that's ideas, but even the next transcendent level is that somehow those things impact our emotions.
Right.
So you've got absolutely a painting or something that in literature, and that impacts you emotionally. That's pretty amazing.
Right. And it's amazing that we get impacted, we think, the way we're supposed to get impacted or thereabouts, from people who had very different emotion sets and completely different lives than we have. And yet it speaks to us in some way. That's when I at the end of every course, almost every course, every lit course, I have a survey the students, and I want to know what they liked best, what they appreciated most. Did we spend enough time on each of the work, all the little data that I can collect. But the question that's most interesting is, what piece did you like best? And in a survey class, and a couple survey classes that go for hundreds of years and get incredibly modern, Gawain and the Green Knight comes out on top about half the time. And that is amazing to me. I can't wait to see the new movie, to see what
I was going to ask you if there's any adaptations that you prefer, if you've seen the new movie.
I've not yet seen the new movie. I hear good things about it, and on the medieval professor lists that I'm on, people are pretty impressed with it. Is it the same story? No. But is it a story that really communicates a lot of what's going on? Yes, it seems to be. I haven't seen it, but I'm looking forward to it. And the fact that that it's still relevant. That's what, and I point out to the students, there's lots, and I could design entire courses of medieval stuff you'd never want to read. Because it doesn't really speak to us anymore. Right. It's got an interest that we no longer share, and so it's nice for context, and it's nice to get a sense of what they probably got out of it or put into it, but it just doesn't work for us.
Well, and what's funny about that is I remember from reading Chaucer, and it's been years since I read any Chaucer, but part of what I remember about it is that it kind of brought home the idea of people are people are people are people, no matter what time period we're talking about. Like, nuns are still gonna act like this, and what is it? There's one of the stories is a woman hangs her rear end out the window, and a guy walks up the ladder to kiss it or something. She tells him to come give her a kiss or something, and someone else hangs their rear end out so he can kiss their rear end. Yeah.
Yes, right. The Miller's Tale.
I mean, that's a pretty...
Always a smash hit.
Exactly. If we can't all relate to that or think it's funny at the very least.
No, I think that's interesting. I like to, when I teach the whole Chaucer course, I start with the Canterbury Tales. I start with 4. The general prologue and 4 Canterbury Tales. And then I drop back to earlier in Chaucer's corpus and teach a couple poems from then, because part of the reason we like the Canterbury Tales is it's incredibly modern I mean, it's still technically pre-modern,
Right.
but those people are recognizable. But what's interesting in some of the earlier of his works is they don't behave in ways, they're more alien. They don't seem similar to us.
Interesting.
And so I want to make sure that we understand that we don't know if Chaucer's peers liked the Canterbury Tales more than they liked Troilus and Crusade, which was his long courtly romance, right? But courtly, that's a tough read. I've never taught that piece in Middle English because it's long and it's difficult, and it's already got enough alien aspects in it that even a decent modernization, students are going, what are we doing here? Right? Much like Beowulf. You can translate Beowulf any number of ways, and it has been translated any number of ways, but lots of it is very hard to get through even in modern English because it's digressions, it's historical moments, it's because it's not just a story, it's how they remember themselves, right? It's a story they tell themselves to know who they are. And there's a person, and I'm foolishly going to be unable to remember her name, but it's a woman who just did a translation of Beowulf that's really interesting because it's modern English, it's street English. So they start rapping at different points, and of course there's the traditionalists are up in arms and it's an abomination. But for all we know, that was street English then.
Right.
So we don't know that it's supposed to be this staid text that's unapproachable.
Right.
Did they write it that way on purpose? No, they wrote it so that they would understand it because it reflected we assume the life that they were living. So this translation, while less probably word for word accurate, is a great read because it is so accessible. And I taught it, and I'm being a bit of a traditionalist, I felt a little bit guilty because that's the only translation we read in that class. If I'd set it beside something else and said, now let's look at these.
Right.
But I have a set of students, and that's the only Beowulf they know. Now it is, again, it's responsible, it's good, it's academic, it's smart, it's just got a bent to it that the earlier ones don't have. They still have a bent, right? Anytime you modernize something, you're changing it.
Right.
You're imposing your own. Anytime you read it, you're changing it. You're imposing your own order on it.
Right.
So I think that, but again, I still feel a little, clearly, this is my apologia. I still feel a little guilty about that. But I think that's how to bring the students into the conversation, because I don't want to teach these things. Isn't this old dead thing interesting? I want to say, isn't this thing still alive? And if so, how is that? What's alive for you? And that's what, and at the beginning of class, some of these things you're going to have no interest in whatsoever. I don't know which those are going to be, right? I haven't included any on purpose because they're all going to hate this one, right? That's not, life's too short. But there are, you get to the end of a sonnet, and some students say, that was really important, that was really neat, I really like that. And other students say, oh, sonnet, schmonnet, what are we doing here? 14 lines, I get it. They got to rhyme a certain way. I get it. So it's interesting, but I think that's narrative is the center point of the podcast, right? So I think it's really interesting that it's only a narrative if somebody listens to it, right?
Right. Yeah. So what do you find is difficult for you as far as teaching goes? Like what part of teaching do you enjoy, and what are the parts that you feel like are difficult for you specifically?
Well, I guess the parts I enjoy are the connections. When lights go on in students and they get the point behind the point, or they leap ahead 3 points, right? Because they got this, right? And they grab the banner and they run ahead, and they're leading. Or even more exciting is when we go into a different direction that I was not anticipating at all. Doesn't this mean this? I think, wait a minute, it just might. Let's figure that out. And then we can all go through the thinking process together, and the examination progress and the process and the interpretation process, and we can all figure out what this might mean. I'm currently teaching the wife of Bath this week in the Chaucer class, and she's very modern, and she's proto-feminist or an early feminist, or what, you can't really use the term feminist of anybody in the Middle Ages, but it's clear. We know what it means. And students are completely split on the
Really?
tale as to whether or not it's not an ambiguous ending. You just don't know what it means. You know exactly how it ends, but you don't know what the ending means because she presented herself in a particular way in a very long prologue and then a very short tale. And then at the end, you got to figure out the relationship, or you don't, between the relationship between her prologue and her tale. So is this ultimate resolution, is it positive? Is it feminist? Is it questioning the subordinate roles of, it's absolutely questioning the subordinate roles of women in the Middle Ages, but what's it arguing for? And the problem is that the male character, who is horrible, who's a rapist, gets rewarded at the end. But he gets rewarded theoretically because he learned something about women, because that's the queen saves him and sends him off for a year to find out what women want. What does woman want? And then he turns out when he talks to women that there's very different answers to that question, which is not what he was thinking, because he wasn't thinking that this person that he was assaulting or her entire gender were people. He's just got this idea. And so he eventually comes up for the answer, but he resigns himself to it and he puts himself under the power of this other woman. And we don't know if he does it because he's learned his lesson, right? He's finally learned how to hear, or because he just gives up.
Right.
But either way, he wins. And it's very uncomfortable to get to the end of that story told by a woman who's very self-possessed and in charge of herself within the constraints of medieval society, to tell a story with that as the happy ending, right? That it's not, maybe he doesn't need to be executed, which was the original sentence, but to win a beautiful wife who will be young and true forever, that seems disturbing. Go ahead.
Is there any indication of how Canterbury Tales was received during its own time?
It was popular, but that's all. We don't have reviews. We do know, or at least the current thinking, I don't know if it's current. Yeah, we'll say current thinking. The Chaucer wrote in the end of the 14th century, and the 15th century in English literature is known as the dull century. And now there's lots of new King Arthur stories and things going on, but overall there are very few literary advances. And part of that is attributed to Chaucer having paralyzed everybody. Because what do you do next? So there's a poet named Lydgate, John Lydgate, who rewrote many of Chaucer's texts at extending them ridiculously. Right, so on, and he's not as talented a poet. But clearly there was a market for that. And
so he almost did like fan fiction.
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
He retells the story. He changes the name, which is all okay in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance, and even somewhat afterwards, innovation was not rewarded. Innovation was not regarded, because what you were supposed to do is tell an old tale a new way. Because there's the challenge. Right? Any nut can make up a new story. So what? But the question, just like Shakespeare, right? We have, I think, all but 2 of his plots or subplots already extant.
Right.
So what did he do? He made them into what they are, and again, I think, and paralyzed everybody, because nobody's still rewriting those.
Right.
Right? Because so it's the same kind of idea, except then other things like the novel get invented shortly after that. So that's a whole new way to go. But so Chaucer seems to have been so big a force that he just pushed everybody to the side, and they were rewriting him. There's the Scottish Chaucerians, there's English Chaucerians, because they're just writing things like that. It's a very simplistic view, but it seems in the main, nobody's teaching a course in 15th century English lit, I'll tell you that.
Well, it sounds like we don't need one.
Exactly. We probably do, but we're going to call it Arthurian lit or something along those lines.
Sure. Okay, so did we ever get to how you got to SIU?
We did not.
Okay.
So I did my 1 year at Bates, and then after that I got the tenure track position that I said at Wilkes University, and I was teaching a 4-4 load, and it was it was a good place, but it wasn't where I needed to be. So I started to think about leaving right around my second year. I was there 3 years total. And then I got a phone call, or probably an email, from two professors here at SIU that had been great friends at Duke. We were all graduate students, Professor Chandler and Professor McCaffrey.
Okay.
And
great.
we were all Duke. And they said, hey, we had an opening for medievalist. Are you at all interested? And I said, oh, please. And so then I shot off my application and came and interviewed, and knock wood, here I am.
Oh, great. And that was when? How long ago was that?
I just finished my 20th year here.
Wow, congratulations.
So thank you.
That's quite
So
a milestone.
That was a while ago. Yes, it is.
And we're all the better for it. I'm glad they reached out.
I'm all the better for it. But yes, it's an exciting department. It's changed obviously over the 20 years and the changes in school and whatnot, but it's always been a terrific place to work in its many iterations.
Sure.
And we've just changed our name to we're now a school instead of the Department of English. And so we'll see. I think that gives us permission to do a lot of things we might have been pondering doing before. And now, since we've just reinvented our identity, we can write that.
Why not, right? Changes are coming regardless.
Exactly. Get out in front.
Get on board or get out of the way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Is there anything that you're working on now that you want anyone to be aware of? Do you have any publications or books that are coming out, or are you still working on publications?
I'm right in the middle of something that's on classical rhetoric and medieval rhetoric, and so it's quite different. And I'm back to reading Latin, and it's off-putting, and I'm not sure the ultimate payoff is going to be worth it. So I'm got my eyes on revisiting. I wrote a piece on Saint Francis.
Oh, neat.
And the presentation. In order to become a saint, you have to have somebody write saints' lives, a saint's life of you. Excuse me, and it has to fulfill certain requirements, and there have to be miracles. And the requirements are pretty, as you might suspect, the requirements for becoming a saint are pretty high.
Yes, the bar is very high there.
and I think rightly so.
Rightfully so, yes.
And so Francis had a number. He was quite a force before he died. The guess is he had 10,000 followers, which is a lot of followers in medieval Europe, right? 13th century Europe. Mm-hmm. And so he was canonized pretty quickly, because if you've got 10,000 people out there, you really want them in the church rather than out of the church. Mm-hmm. And so his saints' lives are very interesting because there are different versions of them, all of which stood. And so we now have different camera angles on him. All of them are legitimate saints' lives and whatnot, but they stress different aspects of him. In one saint's life, he is imitable, so you can become Francis, right? He walked out of his father's house in nothing but his shirt and gave up on. He led the apostolic life. He didn't work. He didn't preach. He was the mendicant, so he begged. Mm-hmm. So the Franciscans were the begging order of the four orders of friars. And so that seems to have been a model for a while, is that we could all be like Francis. But then Saint Bonaventure, who came from a very different background, and was running part of the church, needed a new life because Saint Francis never touched money. And by the time Bonaventure comes along, there's a lot of money in the Catholic Church. There's a lot of money in the Catholic Church, and you can't really have one of your center pillars against what you need to do every day for business.
Right. And
so then there's a sort of a revision of Saint Francis at that point, and then he becomes more, I think I call the piece imitanda and admiranda. So either you can imitate him, or the later Saint Francis, we're just supposed to admire him because he's on a pedestal and he's different from the rest of us. So we shouldn't be doing that, right? We shouldn't be following those footsteps. So I've been playing with that, going back to that, because I think the rhetoric, while interesting, is a lot of spade work, and I think the going may be too slow to get a product out of that. Whereas I can go back to the St. Francis, and that's the fire. I can always go back to the other, right? I don't think there's a rule that once you set aside a manuscript for a while, you can't pick it up again, because that's what I'm doing with Francis. So that I'm very excited about that, and that's more my time period, and it's more my area of expertise. And I've written on religious communities a couple times before. I've written on the Jews in the Middle Ages, which is quite problematic and traumatic, and so this is closer to that. So I think that's where I'm headed next.
Okay. Well, are you open to, if people have questions about your classes, are you willing to have people reach out by email and ask questions if they have any?
Sure, absolutely. Next semester, I'm teaching 121, which is Western literary tradition, and that's all. I'm only teaching one course next semester. So that's a course that starts with Iliad. Well, it starts with the Old Testament, and then the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then moves up really only just to the Middle Ages and maybe one medieval text. So it's very old. Oftentimes classics students take it because it counts. I don't know if it counts toward the major, but it counts toward the minor. And so lots of students, classics, I would guess, has far more minors than they do majors because of the language challenges. So I've taught that same course, different versions of it before. I'm not sure what I'm going to, last time I taught it, it was Self and Society. And the time I taught it before that, it was War and Peace. And now I would like, given the times, I think I'd like to teach something a little more lighthearted. So maybe focus on some comedies.
Okay. All right. Well, we have things to look forward to then.
Well, thank you.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being here. Thanks for working with me on this project. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have more to come. And like we just said, if anyone has any questions for Professor Amos, feel free to reach out to him at his SIU email. And that's really it for us. So thank you very much for being here, Professor Amos.
Well, terrific. I appreciate the conversation, and the series sounds great. Now I have to go back and look at the other one.
There you go.
Now I get to go back.
Yes, that's right. Well, thank you very much. Tell all your friends.
I shall do that.
Well, you have a lovely evening.
First, I'll go back and look at me, and if this doesn't work, then I'll tell no one.
There you go.
I'll deny it all the way.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that's fair. Well, you have a great evening.
Great. Thanks, you too. Enjoyed the conversation.
Bye.
Bye-bye.